Hello, everyone, and welcome to the One Sustainability Conference, our annual global sustainability event. We now have the pleasure to welcome Gabriel Thoumi, the founder and CEO of Responsible Alpha at One Sustainability. Gabriel will tell us more about transition strategies to a sustainable economy. Gabriel, thank you, and welcome to One Sustainability.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Stelios, and the One Sustainability team. It's a pleasure to be here again, and let's just jump right in. The presentation is going to have two parts. The first, the state of the planet, with some scientific jargon and information to inform you what it looks like from a natural resource scientist's perspective. The second part of the presentation will be based on capital market strategies to mitigate the risks that the first part of this presentation is describing. First of all, I work at Responsible Alpha. We're a consultancy whose mission is to support institutions and enable their transition to a low carbon, sustainable, and equitable future. This is our planet. There's no planet B. And in our planet right now, we're facing multiple overlapping, in some cases, catastrophic systemic risks. But there is hope and there is action that's happening today and on the horizon. Let's talk about those. In 2021, 87% of the Earth's surface was significantly warmer than over the previous period of 1951 to 1980. It's a climate metric, not weather. Why can we say that's climate? 1950 to 1980 is 30 years. And that's the unit that climate change is measured in. So 87% of the Earth was hotter than it should be compared to pre-industrial period. In fact, we see significant temperature increase also occurring in the ocean. Here we have the globe, ocean temperatures set a new record in 2020, and 93% of the extra heat trapped by human-made global warming goes into the ocean. We're seeing global warming occur on land, in the ocean, in the air. We see the temperature increase in the atmosphere, in the column of the atmosphere of 0.2 degrees Celsius. If you look at you can measure the temperature increase of the Earth going down 2,000 meters in the ocean. That too has increased, as you can see on the image. So climate change is happening. Not only do we have increasing temperature or warm days with extreme weather events happening on land, we also have this happening in the ocean. Extreme weather days or heat days are increasing in the ocean. This has resulted in extreme temperatures, droughts, and fires, floods and mudslides and storms increasing over the last 40 years. Now, there are three greenhouse gases you may be familiar with that are driving this change. All three of them have seen significant increases in parts per million. Think of one marble changing color from white to black out of a million, or parts per billion, one marble changing color from white to black out of a billion since pre-industrial times. In the case of carbon dioxide, we've had significant increase since 1850, from 280 parts per million to now 418 parts per million. That was a measurement today, according to Bloomberg. We see increases also in parts per billion of methane, as you can see in the screen, and on nitrous oxide. So there's not just one greenhouse gas, there's a multitude of greenhouse gases. Now, of course, the largest source of global warming pollution is the burning of fossil fuels, which have increased since 1850. We're familiar with that. This is resulting and systemic risks that impact our food supply, our water, and global health. We see water impacts both on reduced supply and increased demand. Demand is increasing for energy use, agriculture, domestic use, and industry, but there's reduced supply as melting ice. The bank, think of ice as a bank. When it melts too quickly, you have less money in the bank. That water then goes down to the ocean eventually. It's the same thing for snowpack. If the snowpack melts too quickly, you have no water in the end of summer for agricultural crops or for your domestic use. So ironically, you have increased demand because of climate change. As the wet gets wetter and the dry gets drier, as extreme weather events increase, but you also have reduced supply of water. We're seeing significant systemic impacts in the food system. This is impacting through drought, heat, pests, fires, safety. An anecdotal story. Why does Mars, the candy manufacturer it's all the wonderful chocolates, they will only purchase peanuts from 6% of the world's supply, because 94% of the world's supply has mold on it called aflatoxin. That may not matter to you, except if you eat those peanuts, you can get very ill, including have liver cancer. This is why in some nations around the world, there are public service announcements about eating those peanuts. That mold, that toxin, is increasing because of the extreme weather. As the dry gets drier and the wet gets wetter, things like mold increase. So we're actually seeing the decreased availability of key food crops as a result of climate change. Climate change materially impacts public health. We are in a moment right now where zoonotic diseases, zoonotic means diseases that come from nature and transfer to humans through think of a carrier, like a bat or a monkey or a tick or a flea. Zoonotic diseases are increasing rapidly, both in frequency and intensity and in their geography around the world. This is why, at times, we actually can find malaria, a tropical disease, in Alaska. That's related to climate change as the extreme weather increases. Now, climate change also materially affects our infrastructure. We're in the midst of seeing that right now, sadly and tragically, in Pakistan, in Florida, and in many, many other countries around the world. And in many of the Earth's systems are reaching their tipping point. Think of this as you're driving a car and then you fall off a cliff. It's a tipping point. We see this in the Greenland ice sheet disintegration that's happening much more quickly than we had ever modeled. I say this as a natural resource scientist and a CFA. But what happens there, just like imagine if you have ice, you put water underneath it, you can slide it across a table more easily if the ice is just on the table. Now put that in an incline. Greenland is melting. The water goes underneath the ice sheet. The ice sheet just slides into the sea. Right now, we're expected to have 9% of Florida underwater in our lifetimes because of this. You see the shutdown of the ocean conveyor belt? That's the conveyor belt. That's a cheeky name for the Gulf Stream. It's how we get warm water and energy itself goes to Europe that warms Europe in winter. And that's why if you look at Europe, it has warmer winters than places in similar latitudes around the world. That's slowing down. So extreme weather disasters of the last decade cost our economy $2.5 trillion, and almost a $1 trillion increase over the previous 10 years. What will it be this decade? $5 trillion? $7 trillion? Concurrent to the climate crisis, we're facing crises around water and biodiversity and economics also. One way to think about this is the extinction rate right now is a factor of 10,000 times greater than its baseline rate. While climate change is happening certainly more quickly than any other time in geologic history, except for when the asteroid hit us in 65 million years ago, that the rate of change of that climate change is facing is much actually slower than we're seeing in biodiversity. But climate change is hiding a similar catastrophe that we're seeing around biodiversity risk. This is why when you look at the Earth and the Earth system, from a systems perspective, we talk about 9 planetary boundaries: ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol loading, ozone depletion, novel entities, which is new ecosystems that are born that may not fit inside a current system, climate change itself, biosphere integrity, which is about biodiversity, land system change, freshwater use, and biogeochemical flows. When you look at the summary analysis on the screen, you can see that, yes, climate change is yellow, but biosphere integrity and biogeochemical flows are at much more severe risk today. Biogeochemical flows, think of the nitrogen and phosphorus pollution that enter our waterways and end up in the ocean. That's why we have dead zones, ocean without any oxygen, parts per million, that surround all of our continents. There's no oxygen in the ocean. All the fish and all the mammals and all the coral will die. But we also see this on land, where you have an increasing quantity of cancer alleys happening all over the world. There are cancer alleys in Louisiana. There are also cancer alleys in Europe, where I live, on the border between Netherlands and Belgium, sadly, where the petrochemical industry has its foothold in Europe. So Swiss Re suggests that the world will lose $23 trillion in value by mid-century if we do not mitigate climate risk. But if we do not mitigate biodiversity risk, water risk, that number will be higher. And certainly if we don't act today, this number will only increase. That's Swiss Re. Now, when we look at where we're going, we can see currently in this map, in this image, where you see blue, which is the very slight changes of 0.05 degrees Celsius in that range that occurred over, that naturally occurred over hundreds of years. And suddenly you can see the red of where we're going. And the shared socioeconomic pathways are how we model where we're going with climate change based on economic trends today and economic and policy levers we can implement to mitigate that change that direction. Bend the curve. Even in the best case scenario, we're facing a much more risky world than we have experienced today and in our lifetimes. In the best case scenario. This means that the climate that we experience will always be much better than the climate our children will experience and our grandchildren. This means the summers of your youth will always be better and have less extreme weather than the summers of our grandkids. When we model out climate change using shared socioeconomic pathways you see in this image, the quantity of tons of CO2 only one of the many of greenhouse gases that we do model, has to go to zero by 2050. In fact, we have to have net negative emissions, but to remove that carbon dioxide starting no later than 2050 to have any chance to have a somewhat stable economy. Because when you start modeling the shared socioeconomic pathways, they don't just model economics, they include the modeling of governmental policy and politics inside of them. And as we go further up the curve, as the curve steepens, in the models by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that they produce includes increasing a decrease in democratic principles and processes around the world, less free will, less access to capital, and many other factors. Someone may not care about climate change, but they care about their investment portfolio. Trust me, or at least hear me. You don't have to trust me, you can hear me. There are no economic returns on a dead planet. So the curve we're facing right now is steep. The change we have to make right now is extraordinary. I don't need ambition. I don't need to tell you what I'm going to do. You need to see what I have done. Do not say. Act, do not talk about it. Now is the time of action. What are you going to do? What am I going to do? We don't have to talk about it. We need to do it. If we want to have, for example, if we want to meet the lowest threshold, which is much more risky than we're at right now at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to have 12% emissions reduction next year. And that's according to S&P. Notice the names talking about this: Swiss Re, S&P. These are the radical movers who are pushing for us to mitigate climate change, biodiversity risk, and water risk, the three factors, because they see those risks in their models, and they are concerned. While there are many pathways to decarbonize the economy, remember, each pathway is dependent on your business profile, your emissions profile. Just like each of us is a different type of athlete, each of us is a different type of thinker, everyone has their own emissions profile from which you need to mitigate your own emissions. And there are decarbonization pathways that one can benchmark your emissions reduction to, such as the one on the screen by IEA. And they're different type, and each pathway includes different factors and different variables in them, which are beyond where we are in today's conversation. Now, carbon taxes is one policy regime that's being deployed to mitigate or decrease emissions. Carbon taxes impose a price per ton emitted using the polluter pays principle. And in many jurisdictions, one has carbon taxes and cap and trade covering the same industries. Cap and trade is different. Cap and trade schemes are when the total amount of carbon emissions is capped, allowing for trading of emissions reductions and allowances. So there's a lot of variability in pricing. In carbon taxes, the opportunity is a fixed rate on taxes, which may benefit financial planning, long-term strategy. At the same time, taxes then accrue to the government, and one has to trust the government that they will use that capital, that revenue, to mitigate emissions. Sometimes it works very well, and just like anything, we're human. Sometimes there are somewhat less successful processes in place. The same thing occurs in cap and trade. Sometimes emissions can be reduced easily. Sometimes there are offsets, and there are other options too that are available. Now, the Paris Agreement brings all these risks together around climate, provides an opportunity for governments who see the risk to act. The key thing to understand about the Paris Agreement that was agreed upon in 2015 by 197 countries was that it's voluntary. It's not a legal treaty. There's no penalty if I do not comply. The Paris Agreement is based on peer pressure. In fact, we have cases where one government makes a set of commitments, and the government that they compete with, their neighbor, makes a separate set of commitments that are stronger. So the first government then says, I need to increase my commitments because I want to be better than my neighbor. And these commitments are assessed and reviewed at least every 5 years with intention that they increase over time. The commitments are based on what that government can do given its economy and its ecology. Now, when we step back for a moment, we talk about sustainability, ESG, and climate. They're very different concepts, okay? This is getting towards the end of the presentation, so give me another 10 minutes, thank you. Sustainability, sustainable development of a country level. That's the Sustainable Development Goals, their targets and their metrics. Climate overlaps with sustainability in some areas, and other areas does not include sustainability. And ESG, environmental social governance, the accounting, scoring, and assessing of companies' actions around environmental social governance issues, and how that may impact materially their related financial products, such as equity, fixed income, derivatives, commodities, and indices, futures and forwards, and other options. That is ESG. So again, sustainability is very broad. Climate's separate, overlaps some, but not 100%. And ESG is a very thin silo. And we see in all three areas, we see significant action to mitigate the risks I described in the first presentation. The Sustainable Development Goals were launched also in 2015, as was the Paris Agreement. The Sustainable Development Goals were developed with industry. So the UN was a facilitator to develop this with industry and government and civil society around the world. There are 17 categories, 169 targets, and 232 metrics. What's important to note is that the 17 categories you see on the left sit inside each other like a wedding cake, as you see on the right. On the right, we have the basis of the SDGs is natural capital, biosphere integrity. That's where you have live life on land, life below water, air. You see the categories there that form the base of the wedding cake. The next smaller category is society. The next smaller ring is economy. The SDGs have been adopted by many financial institutions. In fact, Nuveen, the asset manager, has some very interesting and successful SDG-related products. They score their products that they're looking at, and whether it's the quantity of investments aligned with primarily aligned with one of the 17 SDGs, and percentage of overall assets under management that are aligned primarily with one of the SDGs. Now, SDGs that are green are commonly accepted, business as usual. Yellow are being developed, and red are aspirational, as you can see underneath each item. Now on climate, that's second circle. We have initiatives such as the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure that has four has again a wedding cake approach to how you assess. You start with governance of the institution. Then one looks at strategy. Then one looks at risk management, which includes opportunities. It's how risk can be modeled, measured, monitored, and managed. Then looks at metrics. And metrics are focused moving from ambition through aspiration to doing, to action. ambition to aspiration to action. Finally, climate risks are then, which are financial risks associated with climate change, and their hazards, exposures, and vulnerability can be determined on 3 levels: an asset level, corporate level, and portfolio level. And they can be calculated using the model of hazards, exposures, and vulnerability. This model has been widely adopted. It provides for the input of physical risks in the bottom left around climate, from climate. That includes acute and chronic risks, subsequent transition risks, as you see on the top left, but then also opportunities from that transition. These risks and opportunities then flow into the income statement, statement of cash flows, and the balance sheet and associated financial metrics, which is one of the types of work that we do at Responsible Alpha. Separately, at a higher level, the central banks and monetary authorities globally have come together under the Network for the Green Financial System here to deploy microprudential, macroprudential, and monetary policy tools to assess climate risks. As we saw, we pause for a moment. SDGs, there are cases where financial institutions like Nuveen are approaching that. You have opportunities on climate. You see the model that I described, that's for financial institutions using the TCFD model and for corporates also. But there's also opportunities in the Network for the Green Financial System to address systemic risks that central banks are using. They're doing this to start to mitigate contagion. Because, for example, a credit risk could migrate from one geography to another due to climate risk. And they're also deploying NGFS to look at transition to system towards stability. How do we map towards we have fewer credit market losses and fewer financial market losses from systemic risk? How do we mitigate that functional risk, that overall risk that Swiss Re was saying of losing $23 trillion in valuation? Which, of course, if we do that analysis, Swiss Re does that analysis in a couple of years from now, it'll be a much higher number unless we start changing our collective economic behavior. Finally, when you think of sustainability, climate, and ESG, you need to think of where you are on a smile. From a environmental social governance perspective, you have traditional finance in the top left, and you have integrated analysis, integration, which will include, maybe sin stocks. Like you have an exclusion on sin stocks. You have corporations that may have a carbon divestment campaign or net zero commitment. There's impact investing on the right, and then philanthropy in the top right. Think of it as a smile. Where is your institution in the climate, sustainability, and ESG space? Finally, ESG Sustainable Investing in the United States has rapidly increased. There are many questions. There are many comments on how much of this. There are many comments on how many of the assets under management are being actively managed towards sustainability, climate, or ESG. Overall, we see assets under management in the United States over $18 trillion aligned with sustainability, climate, and ESG in some manner currently. And that's an incredible change from 20 years ago. And we're also seeing disclosure happening. Now in the EU, where I live, disclosure around climate is becoming mandatory. And where many of you live in the United States, disclosure by the SEC, that the SEC will request, will start to become mandatory, certainly in the next couple of years. Finally, green bonds are also growing. We see this market having gone from not existing 10 years ago to now being a global market. And it will only increase as we start to ring fence, as bonds start to, as corporates start to, in the public and private sector, start to increasingly ring fence their debt around specific infrastructure projects to mitigate, adapt to, and address climate change, biodiversity, and water risks. So thank you so much for letting me share the state of sustainable finance today. If you have any questions, let me know. As always, it's a pleasure to work with Stelios, James, and your team at One Sustainable. My name is Gabriel Thoumi. You can reach out to me on my email or on LinkedIn. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Well, Gabriel, I must say this was very impressive. I have never seen such an inclusive overview of all the issues. And this is definitely the best way forward. A question that comes to mind almost all the time is, why is there such a lack of momentum? I mean, it seems that so many companies have a way of running their business, earning their money. Why change? And in so many other areas, there are people unwilling to change, to confront perhaps the implications of the changes. And also in politics, there's, for many reasons, unwillingness to change. So given what you say and its urgent importance, how can we build a bit more pressure and momentum to move ahead more creatively and more meaningfully?
I don't know if this saying is attributed to Bill Gates accurately. I've heard it said that he may have said this. So I'm maybe making up a quote that was never said. If we look at 1 year at a time when they were starting Microsoft, it's extraordinarily difficult. When they look at where they've gone over 10 years, they were profoundly successful. So I think, one, we have to have time scale and understand that, yes, there are long dated risks we have to be aware of. What am I doing today? But what we're doing today also requires possibly some business innovation around how we do business, around transparency, collaboration, coordination, and even in some ways, that what is the nature of intellectual property? If I have a climate solution, do I patent it and protect it? Maybe that helps me in the near term. But if that may help me in my idiosyncratic risk and opportunity to grow my assets. But does that address the systemic risks that we're facing? So I think in some regards, often we need to have a slightly different approach to how we think and consider and approach the issue. And that's where innovation occurs. Finally, what I have seen in my career is the greatest innovation that I've seen occur in sustainable finance, climate finance, and ESG as a fact, but around the soft skills of effective communication and listening, empathy, saying hi without an agenda, learning about who you're talking to, just having trust and faith that it will work out, but we don't know how.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I would add training as well. There's so many new areas where training is required, and so many young people could be available for that. That's another area of effort I think is important.
It is.
Yeah.
The great joys we have at Responsible Alpha, there's an irony. We will have many different names pass through the company. So is churn a good thing or a bad thing? On the one hand, we're a small company. We offer, contracting roles. It is not going to pay much of a rent, but it helps the people grow, helps grow the business. And one of the greatest joys I had is having one of our staff join, but we had an open conversation. And I was like, I was guessing that they would leave within 3 months, because I knew that they could get, once they got a job with me, when you have a job, you can get a better job. And they did. And I was thrilled. I was like, yes, that's the model. Someone comes in, gets trained, and is able to grow and move into the next role. And that's really exciting, because that's part of, that has informed our commitment to hiring as many career switchers and people of different ages and different backgrounds and skills as we can into Responsible Alpha. because we want to provide that platform for that active learning by doing, by which then they can grow their careers and move on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these comments. Gabriel, it's been a real pleasure to welcome you to One Sustainability. And the points you make, I believe, will have huge impact. And we hope this will go a long way in really leading to change. So we thank you very much for your contribution and look very much forward to remaining in contact and connecting again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. Have a nice day.